It's easy to feel completely swamped by the news, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Every day just brings this fire hose of information, conflicting reports, complex situations. They change minute by minute. How do you possibly cut through all that noise and make sense of it?
Well, that's exactly why we're here. This is the deep dive.
All right.
You've gathered this stack of sources, articles, reports, notes, and we're going to take the dive together. We'll pull out the most important insights, connect the key pieces, and help you understand what truly matters from this material.
Okay, and today we're focusing on sources that zero in on June 10th, 2025. As you look across everything you collected for that day, a picture starts to emerge. Really intense political tensions here in the U.S., especially centered around immigration and, well, questions of federal power.
Yeah, alongside a complicated global scene. You've got diplomacy happening right alongside ongoing conflicts.
Yeah, running through it all. A fascinating look at the media landscape itself, how we're getting this news, and just how challenging it is, frankly, to navigate information these days.
So our goal is pretty straightforward. Walk you through your material, highlight the crucial points, show you how things connect, and just make it all click.
Right.
We want you to come away feeling well-informed, not overwhelmed.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Let's do it.
We're going to start right here at home in the United States, specifically focusing on Los Angeles because, well, on Juneteenth, that city was a real flashpoint.
Yeah, your sources show this was actually the 5th day in a row of protests reacting to stepped-up immigration enforcement by the Trump administration.
And the situation on the ground, it escalated quickly, didn't it, according to the reports you gathered?
It did. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass declared a curfew downtown, citing reports of vandalism and looting during the demonstrations.
And then things got even more intense, with a pretty significant federal response.
President Trump reportedly ordered an additional 2,000 National Guard and 700 Marines into the city.
Wow. And this wasn't isolated to L.A., right? The protests extended to other major cities, you noted.
Right, like Chicago, San Francisco, Austin, and Dallas, too. It was spreading.
So, looking at the specifics from law enforcement on that day, what does your material say?
It mentions 197 arrests in L.A., 67 of those were specifically for blocking a section of Highway 101.
Okay.
There were also reports that 7 police officers were injured.
And the rhetoric coming from President Trump, as your sources describe it, was really stark.
Yeah, he reportedly called protesters animals and a foreign enemy, and even indicated he was open to using the Insurrection Act.
That's the law allowing domestic military deployment, essentially.
Exactly. To enforce law or suppress rebellion, it's a big step.
And this drew a very strong pushback from California's leaders, predictably.
Oh, definitely. Governor Gavin Newsom and the state attorney general sought a court order to block the federal intervention.
And your sources quote Newsom calling Trump's actions a deliberate attempt to create disorder and chaos.
An assault on democracy. Strong words.
Very strong. And he didn't mince words, reportedly urging citizens to resist, saying things like, what Donald Trump wants most is your allegiance, your silence. Do not give it to him.
Yeah, and your sources also point out Newsom countering claims that LA was hell by comparing California's murder rate.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, noting it was lower than some states represented by politicians criticizing Los Angeles, using stats to push back.
And there was a direct financial cost noted in the material as well, wasn't there?
Yes, the Pentagon estimated the cost of this LA deployment at $134 million.
$134 million. That's substantial.
It is. And looking at the broader context your sources provide, this federal deployment was particularly notable.
How so?
It was highlighted as one of the first times state National Guard units were activated for this kind of domestic issue without the governor's request in decades.
Okay, that's a key point. Without the governor's request.
Right. It really underscored the escalation against resistance to mass deportations.
And the political tensions weren't just on the streets, right? Your sources mentioned something about a congresswoman.
That's right. The Justice Department reportedly filed charges against a sitting representative, LaMonica McIver, a Democrat from New Jersey.
And what were the charges related to?
Allegedly obstructing federal law enforcement during an Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, incident back in May.
And her reaction?
McIver apparently viewed this as political intimidation. That's how she framed it.
And adding another layer of, well, high-stakes rhetoric to the day, your sources mentioned the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah, issuing a warning about the potential for nuclear war.
Which is Quite a statement.
It is, and this warning was linked to a political elite who she suggested might believe they could survive such a conflict in private shelters, so quite alarming stuff.
Definitely. So looking at all these pieces together, the protests, the federal response, the rhetoric, the charges against a representative, these high-level warnings, what does it signify? What's the bigger picture here from your sources?
Well, your sources really suggest this highlights a deepening constitutional conflict between federal and state authorities.
Specifically around domestic law enforcement and deploying military forces among civilians.
Exactly. And the pattern here is concerning. This kind of federal action, especially overriding state authority, could set a precedent.
A precedent that erodes state rights.
Potentially, yes. And it could make the national political divide even wider.
So when you connect the dots, President Trump's language, the focus on mass deportations, charging a sitting representative who protested these actions, what's the implication?
It suggests the administration might be using immigration enforcement, not just to enforce the law, but potentially as a way to suppress political opposition and, increase executive power.
Which obviously has significant implications for fundamental rights like civil liberties and freedom of assembly.
Absolutely. It echoes Governor Newsom's strong words about democracy being under attack, which you noted in your sources.
Your material also points to a distinct information war happening right alongside the physical events.
Yes, that's a really interesting angle. There are notes about right-wing bots, trolls, conspiracy theorists, and Meji influencers flooding social media,
What were they saying?
reportedly attacking immigrants and Democrats defending President Trump. And some accounts were apparently linked to Russia.
And that contrasts sharply with Governor Newsom using actual crime statistics to counter that LA is hell narrative you mentioned.
Exactly. It looks like potentially a coordinated effort through disinformation aimed at justifying aggressive federal action and making political opposition look illegitimate.
Which creates this really distorted reality, making it incredibly hard for the public to figure out what's actually true.
Right. And that difficulty in discerning facts, well, it can really weaken traditional journalism and the democratic process itself.
And beyond the political and social implications, there's a clear economic cost woven through this.
Absolutely. That estimated $134 million cost for the LA military deployment is a direct result of this domestic unrest and federal intervention.
And while not directly tied to LA, your sources also touch on the broader economic impact of President Trump's tariffs on businesses, right?
Yes, citing examples like designer brands withdrawing their financial forecasts and J.M. Smucker reporting lower sales.
So what these examples from your sources show is a pretty clear theme.
Yeah, that political decisions, especially those around trade and domestic stability, can have significant immediate economic ripple effects.
Hitting business confidence and the national economy.
Exactly.
Okay, so moving from the intense situation in LA and its direct fallout, your sources also highlight other significant domestic actions and policy points from June 10th.
Right. The Trump administration continued its clear focus on border security. The material mentions claims of historic low illegal crossings.
Attributed to what they called whole-of-government historic actions.
Yes. And there's also mention of a proposed big, beautiful bill aimed at boosting resources for border enforcement.
And related to this, something about the Sinaloa cartel.
The U.S. sanctioned the Los Chapitos faction of the Sinaloa cartel and its leaders, specifically for their role in fentanyl trafficking.
Which your sources note is a leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 49.
A tragic statistic. And diplomatic efforts in this area continue as well.
Like the Deputy Secretary of State's planned travel.
Exactly. Christopher Landau was planning travel to Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala. The stated goals were strengthening ties, boosting U.S. investment, and crucially, emphasizing ending illegal migration.
Okay. Now, shifting to a different area of domestic policy, your sources note a really significant action by the HHS Secretary RFK Jr.
Yes, this one definitely stands out. He reportedly dismissed all members of a key CDC vaccine policy committee.
All of them.
All of them. And this move, according to the reports you gathered, raised concerns among vaccine advocates.
Suggesting a potential shift in national public health guidance, and maybe questions about the independence of these scientific advisory bodies.
Precisely. And in another area impacting federal agencies, the Justice Department reportedly stated that President Trump has the authority to unilaterally revoke national monuments that protect landscapes.
Okay, another potential shift, this time in environmental and land use policy.
Which conservation groups would likely strongly oppose, as you'd expect.
And finally, your sources mention a White House memo regarding public broadcasting.
Yes, requesting to claw back funds that had already been allocated to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB.
And NPR's reaction.
They reportedly warned this could mean the end of public media as we know it.
That's a strong statement.
It is. They mentioned risks to local news, national reporting, and crucial emergency alert services. And they point out in your sources this is for a relatively tiny amount of money, less than 0.01% of federal spending.
So when you look at the dismissal of the CDC committee members, the stance on national monuments, the move against CPB funding, what picture emerges from your sources about how the administration is operating?
It suggests a pattern, doesn't it? Where the Trump administration seems to be trying to align federal agency policies and advisory bodies with its specific ideological agenda.
Potentially overriding established scientific consensus or environmental protections.
That's the concern raised in the material, yes. It indicates that policy decisions might increasingly be driven more by political directives than by expert evidence-based advice.
With potential consequences for public health, environmental protection.
And the perceived independence of scientific institutions.
And the move against CPB funding seems particularly strategic when you connect the dots.
How so?
Well, it targets a sector that provides independent news and potentially critical perspectives of the administration.
Right. So it aligns with that broader strategy mentioned in your sources to potentially weaken or silence independent media.
Limiting public access to unbiased news and encouraging a more controlled information environment.
And this directly echoes Governor Newsom's comments you noted earlier about President Trump delegitimizing news organizations and attacking the First Amendment.
It points to what looks like potentially a systematic effort to control the narrative.
Your sources also highlighted a couple of other significant U.S. developments that day, moving away from policy for a moment.
Right. One story that grabbed a lot of attention was the Sean Diddy Combs case.
Yes. Hip-hop mogul Sean Diddy Combs was formally charged in federal court with sex trafficking and racketeering on June 10th, and he pleaded not guilty.
Your sources mentioned this trial started back in May.
And is expected to finish by July 4th. They describe it as generating salacious headlines and graphic testimony.
With that 2016 tape allegedly showing Combs assaulting Cassie serving as central evidence.
Apparently so. He was reportedly held without bail and could face at least 15 years if convicted on all charges.
What this case demonstrates, based on the way it's presented in your material, is how these high-profile celebrity legal cases,
especially ones with dramatic details, can really capture and hold public attention for weeks, right?
Absolutely. And your sources suggest this highlights the media's role in shaping public perception.
And how such cases can potentially overshadow or even distract from broader political and economic events happening at the same time.
Okay. Now, shifting gears completely to the financial world, let's look at the stock market on June 10th, 2025.
All right. U.S. stock markets closed higher for the third day in a row.
Pretty good run.
Yeah. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ Composite were both up 0.6%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 0.3%.
And what were the drivers, according to your sources?
They largely attributed this rise to investor hopes connected to the easing of tariffs, strong corporate earnings reports, and positive economic indicators.
Any specific company performance mentioned in your material?
Yes. Tesla stock jumped a significant 5.7% that day.
Why the jump?
Your sources tie this to hints from CEO Elon Musk about the upcoming launch of the company's robotaxi service and, this is interesting, a perceived easing of tensions between Musk and President Trump.
So personal dynamics potentially moving markets.
It seems that way. Also, Warner Bros. Discovery stock rose 5% after announcing plans to split into two separate companies.
Okay. Any losers?
On the flip side, yeah. Food producer J.M. Smucker stock dropped nearly 16% due to lower than expected sales and profit forecasts.
Ouch. So when you connect these dots, it's really interesting how explicit the link was made in your sources between the market rise and
On hopes Trump would lower tariffs and the easing of tensions between Musk and President Donald Trump, it's spelled out.
This really shows a direct correlation between market confidence and not just perceived trade stability, but even, like you said, the personal relationships between influential business figures and political leaders.
It appears that political rhetoric and actions, whether it's about applying or potentially easing tariffs or, public conflicts between a president and a major CEO, can directly influence investor sentiment and market performance.
Leading to significant swings based on perceptions of policy or stability.
Absolutely. It highlights how intertwined politics, business, and even individual personalities have become in the global economy.
Okay, let's pivot now and look at what your sources tell us was happening on the global stage on June 10th.
All right. One key area was U.S.-China relations, with trade talks happening in London.
And what came out of those?
Your material reports these talks resulted in an agreement on a framework to resolve trade disputes.
A framework sounds preliminary.
It does. The U.S. Commerce Secretary expressed optimism about resolving restrictions on tariffs, rare earth minerals, and chip shipments. China reportedly approved some rare earth exports as a gesture of goodwill.
Okay, some positive signs then.
Yes, and a senior White House advisor suggested these talks could lead Beijing to accelerate rare earth shipments in return for Washington facilitating access to technology exports. So, some give and take.
However, I sense a but coming.
You sense correctly. Your sources also include a really important cautionary note right alongside this positive news.
Which is?
The pause on President Trump's high tariffs was set to end the following month.
What?
And with few comprehensive trade deals negotiated, the country was heading into what's described as a potentially uncomfortable summer period, causing hiring and investment freezes.
So what's striking here is the pattern. While a framework agreement sounds like progress,
The information about the looming tariff deadline and lack of comprehensive deals suggests this might be more of a temporary de-escalation or maybe symbolic gesture than a deep, long-term solution.
the theme emerging here, as highlighted in your sources, seems to be that these complex international trade disputes involve long negotiations.
Where wins are often incremental and easily overshadowed by ongoing tensions or approaching deadlines.
And the consequence is continued uncertainty for global businesses, despite diplomatic announcements.
Exactly. Now, another high-stakes global issue noted in your material was President Trump initiating what's described as high-risk talks regarding Iran's nuclear program.
High-risk talks. How are they characterized?
Reports indicated the situation seemed close to a deal at times, while at other moments negotiations risk collapse, potentially leading to airstrikes. Very volatile.
But what's particularly revealing from your sources is the perspective from Iran itself, right?
Yes, this was fascinating. Despite the gravity of these talks, ordinary Iranians were reportedly indifferent, greeting the news with a shrug.
Indifferent, why?
This widespread apathy is explicitly linked in your material to past experiences with the Iranian regime's corruption and President Trump's previous withdrawal from a similar agreement. Basically, been there, done that, didn't work.
So when you connect the dots here, the material suggests that a history of unfulfilled promises, political instability both internal and external, and the perceived ineffectiveness of past diplomatic efforts can lead to widespread public cynicism and disengagement.
Yeah. The consequence, as your sources highlight, is that even diplomatic initiatives with significant geopolitical outcomes can lose their persuasive power and public legitimacy if the affected population perceives them as repetitive, superficial, or ultimately ineffective.
They just tune out.
Pretty much.
Okay. Beyond trade and nuclear talks, your sources pointed to other global flashpoints on Juneteenth.
Tragically, yes. The material reports on a school shooting in Austria that resulted in 10 deaths.
Awful. Any details on motive?
A farewell letter was found, but the motive reportedly remained unclear. Your sources noted a rite was held for the victims, the chancellor spoke publicly, and candles were lit as the community mourned.
And the situation in Gaza was also highlighted in your material.
Yes, sadly. 36 Palestinians were reportedly killed that day while trying to receive desperately needed aid.
Oh, that's horrific.
It is. Activists, including Greta Thunberg, reportedly reiterated their determination to continue efforts to deliver humanitarian assistance amidst the blockade. An aid convoy was noted as reaching Libya en route to Gaza, aiming to bypass the current blockade.
And there were actions related to funding and sanctions, too.
Yes. In a separate but connected development, the U.S. sanctioned 5 individuals and 5 sham charities that it claimed were financially supporting Hamas under the guise of humanitarian aid.
Okay.
They also reportedly targeted a sham charity linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, reiterating their commitment to preventing terror groups from misusing the nonprofit sector.
But simultaneously, other countries were sanctioning Israeli officials.
That's right. Your sources noted that several countries, including the UK, Canada, Norway, and New Zealand, sanctioned far-right Israeli ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich for inciting violence against Palestinians, imposing travel bans.
And the U.S. reaction to those sanctions.
The U.S. publicly stated it found these particular sanctions extremely unhelpful, arguing they did nothing to bring about a ceasefire and that allies should instead focus on Hamas as the real culprit.
So, a really complex picture from your sources. Conflicting approaches to a humanitarian crisis. Different actors using aid and sanctions in very different ways.
Absolutely. And also on the global stage that day, your material mentioned Brazil's former president, Jair Bolsonaro, testifying in the Supreme Court.
What was that about?
He's accused of plotting a coup to stay in power after his 2022 election defeat.
Wow. Your sources noted this as a historic moment, right? For a former leader facing trial for trying to overthrow the government.
Exactly. A significant event for Brazil.
So when we look at these events together, the Austria shooting, the Gaza situation, the Bolsonaro trial, what broader patterns do they reveal based on your material?
Well, the Austria school shooting and the Bolsonaro coup trial, though in different regions, seem to highlight a concerning global pattern of internal political and social instability potentially leading to violence.
How so?
The school shooting contributes to broader international concerns about gun violence and radicalization, even if the motive isn't clear from your sources.
And the Bolsonaro trial.
That underscores the fragility of democratic institutions when political leaders attempt to overturn election results. The material suggests the underlying theme is a worrying global trend, where internal political extremism and violence pose significant threats to domestic stability and fundamental democratic norms.
And the Gaza situation fits into this global picture how?
As we noted, the way it's presented in your sources reveals this complex web where a humanitarian crisis is deeply intertwined with political and military objectives.
Leading to that fragmented and often contradictory international response we discussed.
Right, where different actors use aid and sanctions as tools of influence, potentially exacerbating suffering rather than just alleviating needs.
Okay. Your sources also touched on a couple of other broader global issues. The UN Ocean Conference.
Yes, UNOC3, happening in Nice, France. Your material highlighted the significant role faith communities are playing there in advocating for ocean protection.
That's interesting. Faith communities stepping up.
Yeah, 2 multi-faith coalitions were reportedly calling for increased global attention, concrete actions, and financial commitments.
What were their main concerns?
Meeting ocean protection goals and climate and biodiversity agreements and addressing threats like deep-sea mining and industrial overfishing.
They emphasize a moral imperative, I imagine.
Exactly. Recognizing oceans as vital for life and climate regulation, your sources note only 8.3% of the world's oceans were protected then, far short of the 30% target.
And the High Seas Treaty, where did that stand?
It needed 60 ratifications to enter force. On June 9th, 18 new countries ratified, bringing the total to 49. So getting closer.
But interestingly, your sources also mentioned that U.S. federal scientists were reportedly blocked from attending this conference.
Yeah, that's a detail included in the material.
So what this section of your material highlights is a pattern. The increasing influence and moral authority of civil society organizations and religious groups in tackling complex global challenges like climate change.
Especially when state-level action is perceived as insufficient or slow, like with the slow ratification of the High Seas Treaty.
It suggests that traditional diplomatic channels are increasingly being supplemented or, pressured by civil society.
Bringing a more diverse range of actors into global governance, definitely a trend to watch.
Okay, turning to conflicts. Ukraine.
Your sources reported a record number of Russian drone attacks in Ukraine, indicating a dangerous escalation. Ukraine was reportedly experiencing the most constant shelling since the early stages of the conflict.
Grim news. And the U.S. position.
The United States reiterated its position as Ukraine's largest supporter, emphasizing its aim to help Ukraine get surface-to-air missile protections.
But despite the fighting, there were still some direct talks happening.
Yes. The U.S. welcomed direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, as seen in recent negotiations in Istanbul, resulting in prisoner exchanges and the repatriation of fallen soldiers. So, fighting and talking.
And in a separate development from your sources, Pakistan and India.
Yeah, Pakistan reportedly accused India of igniting an inferno with a series of missile strikes.
So the report of record Russian drone attacks and Pakistan accusing India of missile strikes, when seen together,
really highlight the continued presence of regional tensions and the volatile nature of international relations, even while some tactical diplomatic efforts like prisoner exchanges occur.
It indicates that despite international pressure and limited dialogue, The underlying drivers of these conflicts remain aggressive and destructive.
Right. The material suggests the core trend is that achieving lasting peace in these complex hotspots is a huge long-term challenge, requiring more than just tactical negotiations.
Okay. Finally, your sources touched on shifts in global entertainment and business, BTS.
Yes. Two members of the K-pop supergroup BTS reportedly completed their mandatory military service, with all seven expected to finish by the end of June.
Raising anticipation for their comeback, I bet.
Definitely noted in the sources. And in the media industry, Warner Bros. Discovery announced plans to split into two separate companies by mid-2026.
Which effectively reverses much of their big 2022 merger, right?
Exactly, a major strategic shift.
So while seemingly very different events, both the BTS military service completion and the Warner Bros. Discovery split reflect what?
The globalized nature of culture and business, really. BTS's return will have a significant cultural and economic impact worldwide, no doubt.
And WBD's separation highlights major adjustments in the highly competitive streaming and media landscape.
Right. The material suggests the theme here is that major global cultural phenomena and large-scale corporate restructurings in entertainment are significant news in themselves.
Because they reflect major economic forces, changes in consumer behavior, and evolving business models on a global scale.
Precisely. They matter.
Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground from the sources you gathered for June 10th, 2025. We've gone from the streets of LA to global boardrooms and conflict zones.
We really have.
And as we wrap up, it's worth thinking about how we even got all this information in the first place and, how we know what to trust. Your sources also provided some really interesting insights into the news landscape itself.
They did. Your material points to organizations consistently seen as reliable with global reach, Access World News, BBC Monitoring, Factiva.
That's a major commercial database, right?
Yeah, for news and business info. Also, FBIS, the Foreign Broadcast Information Service Archive and Press Reader for broad global news.
Plus the major U.S. papers.
Right. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal are highlighted as essential, along with news agencies like Associated Press and Reuters. And NPR is noted as a key public media source for in-depth reporting.
But what's really brought into focus by the nuances and criticisms within your sources is how complex and often debated the whole idea of impartiality is in contemporary journalism.
Yeah, even for these respected outlets.
For example, the Washington Post's opinion page is focusing solely on personal liberties and free markets and stopping presidential endorsements.
Yeah.
That drew criticism for potentially limiting debate.
And your material also notes the Post faced scrutiny for publishing advertising supplements from China daily and running fossil fuel ads. Questions about influence there.
The Wall Street Journal's news reporting is described in your sources as small counties conservative.
Oh, yes. And it has faced scrutiny for its coverage of President Trump and the influence of its opinion section.
And the AP Style book, which so many outlets use.
Criticized for showing a moderate liberalism and cementing the status quo on sensitive topics like climate change and Palestine, according to your sources.
And the New York Times, while aiming for impartiality in news.
Your material reports it's experienced an increasing amount of left-leaning bias and advocacy in its news coverage, particularly on social issues. Critics in your sources describe its news pages as explicitly anti-Trump.
And NPR operates in this same media ecosystem where its perceived leanings are discussed, despite its stated aim to serve the whole nation and reflect diverse perspectives.
Yeah, and even Reuters, with its principle of take no side, tell all sides, and the BBC, with its charter for impartiality, have historically faced accusations of bias from various political groups. It's not new.
So what your sources really bring into focus here is how tricky the idea of impartiality is. It seems influenced by factors like ownership, editorial policy, how the public perceives the outlet.
Exactly. It seems that while journalistic ethics aim for objectivity, inherent human biases and maybe commercial or political pressures can subtly or overtly influence how news is presented.
So the key takeaway for you as a listener navigating all this information.
That cross-referencing what you're learning from multiple sources, keeping in mind their known or perceived editorial leanings is just crucial.
Crucial to building a truly balanced and comprehensive understanding rather than relying on just one reliable source.
It's really about media literacy, isn't it?
It really is. Your sources also highlight a growing trend where that traditional line between objective news reporting and subjective commentary or advocacy seems to be blurring.
Yeah, that's another key point. Reuters explicitly states there's a fundamental distinction between fact-based news stories and clearly labeled opinion pieces. clear separation.
But in contrast, as we noted, the New York Times is highlighted for incorporating left-leaning bias and advocacy into its news coverage.
And the Washington Post's owner reportedly set the focus for the opinion section. The WSJ's news reporting, being described as small cup conservative, suggests even its news pages might have a subtle ideological tilt.
So this suggests a growing trend where that clear line between reporting and opinion or advocacy is getting less distinct. Kind of murky.
It seems so. Your sources indicate that commercial pressures, like appealing to a specific audience and political agendas, can lead to this more integrated approach rather than a strictly separated one for news and opinion.
The big consequence here is that we, as your guides on this deep dive, and you as a consumer of information, need to be really aware not just of the source itself,
But also the type of content you're engaging with. Is it straight reporting, or is it news that has some subtle bias or advocacy mixed in? You have to ask that question.
definitely. And looking at how different podcasts covered the events of June 10th, based on your sources, is another lens on this information landscape.
Right. The LA protests and military deployment were a major focus for multiple podcasts.
You listed the New York Times, The Daily, Reuters World News, BBC's Newscast, NPR's All Things Considered, The Wall Street Journal's What's News, and CNN's Five Things. Big story, covered everywhere.
Exactly. What you can see here is that major events naturally become central to the news cycle across many platforms. But each podcast offered a slightly different angle or depth.
Could you give an example from the sources?
Sure. The New York Times focused on the Trump-Musk feud aspect related to LA. The BBC highlighted the Trump-Newsom clash. NPR looked at the impact on immigrant communities and military concerns. The WSJ focused on the market reaction, and CNN covered the cost and broader political context.
Different facets of the same story.
Precisely. This underscores that while the importance of a story drives widespread coverage, each outlet's unique identity, audience, and editorial strengths shape its narrative.
For you, the listener, this is actually a valuable opportunity, isn't it?
Absolutely. Your sources show you can synthesize these different perspectives to build a more nuanced, multidimensional picture rather than relying on just one potentially limited narrative.
And your sources show that beyond just covering daily headlines, podcasts are becoming important avenues for specialized, in-depth analysis.
And behind-the-scenes reporting that traditional broadcast news might not offer. AP is the story behind the AP story, providing insights into the Sean Diddy Combs trial from the reporters covering it, is a great example from your material.
Yeah, or NPR's All Things Considered, including specific segments on particular policy changes, like the HHS CDC vaccine committee changes, or critical social issues, like the fight against fentanyl.
Offering a deeper dive than a headline would allow.
This shows that podcasts can provide significant added value for listeners who want more context, background, and expert commentary on specific topics beyond just a quick news report.
For sure.
Okay, wow. We've taken a really thorough deep dive into the stack of sources you provided for June 10th, 2025.
We certainly have. We've explored everything from the intensifying immigration situation and political clashes in the U.S.
to complex global events like trade negotiations, ongoing conflicts, humanitarian challenges, and even shifts in the entertainment industry.
And we've also looked at the very sources of this information, highlighting that navigating the news today requires understanding the nuances of impartiality and those blurring lines between straight reporting and opinion.
So the key takeaways from the day's news, as revealed through your sources, seem to point to deepening domestic political polarization.
A complex global landscape where tactical diplomacy happens alongside persistent conflict and humanitarian crises.
And an evolving media environment where consumers need to be really critical navigators.
That sums it up well. Our hope is this deep dive has given you a much clearer, more structured understanding of what was happening on that day.
Extracting the key insights and connections from what can definitely feel like information overload.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given the patterns we've seen today, the information war, the challenges to impartiality, the difficulties in discerning facts amidst competing narratives, what strategies can you use going forward to build your own most reliable picture of the world and its events?
Yeah, what stands out to you from this deep dive that you'll want to explore further? Something to think about.